I never thought something like this could happen to me. Not because I am special or an overly cautious mother who controls every step of her child, but because there are things that seem so impossible that they don't even register in one's mind. I was gone for just 5 minutes. Just 5 short minutes, during which nothing important was supposed to happen. But when I returned, my son was gone. This sentence I repeated so many times that it became just words without meaning, a kind of noise constantly echoing in my head. I told it to the police, to investigators, to neighbors, to my mother, to everyone who tried to understand how such a thing could have happened. But these words were more for me than for anyone else. I was gone for just 5 minutes. It was an ordinary day, like many others. The morning began the same way as hundreds of our other mornings. He woke up before me, as always, and was already running around the apartment barefoot. His hair was tousled, and his pajamas hung a little below his shoulder, revealing a tiny vaccination scar. He loved to crawl under my blanket, press his cheek against my neck, and quietly whisper that he wanted breakfast or to watch cartoons. And I always smiled, even when I was terribly tired, because his voice was the best alarm clock in the world. That morning, we had breakfast together in the kitchen. He ate his favorite porridge, and I thought about the pile of things I needed to do that day. Then he asked for cartoons. I sat him on the couch, covered him with a blanket, turned on the television, and told him I would be back soon, just to throw out the trash and get my jacket from the car. This was a normal thing, nothing special, nothing dangerous. I left the house without even locking the door, just gently closing it so he wouldn't hear noise from the hallway. And when I returned, the first thing I felt was a strange, heavy silence. A silence that could be felt with one's entire body. The television was on. The cartoon he loved so much was playing on the screen, but the couch was empty. The blanket lay on the floor, as if it had been hastily thrown off, and a toy lay nearby. I called his name, calmly at first, then louder, until I myself was frightened by my own voice. I ran around the entire apartment, looking in every corner, every closet, even in places where he definitely couldn't fit. He was not there. I ran out into the stairwell, calling for him, but the only answer was my own echo. It became hard for me to breathe, as if someone had pressed a heavy stone against my chest. I thought that maybe he had run after me outside, wanted to help me as he sometimes did. But the street was also empty. A few people walked by, but no one who even remotely resembled my son. I ran, screamed, cried, begged for help. Neighbors came out at the commotion, but no one could say anything. No one saw him leave. No one heard anything suspicious. He just disappeared, as if dissolved into thin air. When the police arrived, I could barely stand. They asked many questions, checked the apartment, inspected the door, looked for traces that weren't there. And I just kept repeating one phrase that I couldn't stop saying. I was gone for just 5 minutes. They tried to comfort me for a long time, saying that they would find him, that I needed to wait, that maybe he just went out to play, and would return soon. But every minute, every hour that passed, killed something important inside me. I sat on the floor by his bed, holding his small t-shirt in my hands, breathing in his scent, and I couldn't believe that this was happening to me. My world shattered into pieces in one brief moment that might never have happened if I hadn't left the apartment then. And I kept thinking about how differently our lives could have turned out if I had stayed home for 1 minute longer, or simply taken him with me, or not left at all. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. The me I was just a few minutes ago no longer existed. The next few hours passed, as if in a fog. I answered police questions, trying to remember every tiny detail of that morning, but my brain seemed to refuse to cooperate. They asked me about neighbors, about whether there had been conflicts in the family, whether I had noticed anyone suspicious near our house, and I only said one thing: no. Nothing unusual had happened. It was an ordinary day, and I just did an ordinary, simple thing that should not have led to anything bad. I was gone for 5 minutes. After the police left, the apartment remained empty, and the silence in it became even more unbearable. I couldn't stay there alone. I felt like I was suffocating, that the walls were closing in around me, as if reminding me of what had happened there. My mother came for me and took me to her place. She said something about it being easier that way, that I needed support, but the words reached me as if through a thick fog, and I couldn't fully understand their meaning. I sat on the couch in her apartment, looking out the window, seeing nothing but my son's face. One and the same thought spun in my head, that I failed to protect the most important thing in my life, that everything that happened was my fault. People around me kept repeating that I shouldn't blame myself, that it could have been an accident, that no one is safe from such a thing. But these words meant nothing. They were just empty noise that had no meaning. I didn't eat, and I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his small face, heard his laughter, which sounded so loud and clear in my memory, as if he were right there. Sometimes I would jump to my feet, running to the door, convinced that he would knock now, that all of this was some terrible mistake, and he would return home safe and sound. But that never happened. A few days later, the police called me again. They showed me photos, asking if I recognized any of these people. These were unfamiliar faces, blurry silhouettes from surveillance cameras that told me nothing. I didn't know these people, had never seen them, and each time I left the station with a feeling of absolute helplessness. Days and weeks passed, and there was no news. My mother began to carefully suggest that perhaps I should think about how to live on, that I needed to return to normal life at least a little. She did it very gently and delicately, afraid to hurt my wound, but I perceived her words with despair. For me, there was no more normal life. It simply didn't exist. It remained there, on that day, when I left the apartment and left my child alone. I constantly thought about how he was living, where he was now, whether he was even alive. And this unknown drove me crazy more than anything else. I started walking the streets aimlessly, peering into every child's face, as if hoping that my son would be among them. Sometimes I would follow people, simply because I thought I recognized his walk, his hair color, the jacket he wore that day in a child. But each time the child turned to face me, it wasn't him. I began to live in this constant anticipation, in fear that I might miss some sign, something important that would help me find him. I stopped feeling normal, stopped talking to friends, stopped answering calls. Every conversation, every meeting was painful because everyone around me tried to support me, saying words that were supposed to soothe, but they only reminded me of my guilt. My world narrowed to one small question that gave me no peace day or night. If I hadn't left the apartment then, if I had just stayed by his side, everything would have been different. But that, if no longer mattered, I was gone for just 5 minutes. And in those 5 minutes, I lost everything I had. Eventually, I started to fear my own thoughts. They spun in my head endlessly without interruption, each time taking me back to that fatal moment. I could no longer remember what I was like before this. All memories of the past seemed foreign to me, as if they belonged to some other person, some happy woman who didn't know how cruel life could be. I lay in bed for hours, motionless, staring at the ceiling, wondering if pain could become a physical part of the body. It seemed to me that I truly felt it, how it lived inside me, heavy and cold, and I couldn't get rid of it. The police continued the search, although months had passed, and hope was fading. I saw it in their eyes when I came to the station. They no longer asked many questions, just gave me papers to sign, said they were keeping the case open, that they were searching, but behind these words there was no longer any real confidence. I saw the hope dimming in their eyes, and that was worse than any truth. I would have preferred them to tell me directly that he was no longer there, to give me the opportunity to say goodbye, and somehow live on, but there was no such clarity. There was only painful, endless waiting. They told me that I had to try to live on, but how can one live on when there is nothing inside but guilt and fear? Every time I went out, I was overcome by panic, afraid that I might miss some important detail, that I wouldn't see him if he suddenly appeared nearby. My eyes constantly searched for him. I looked at every child's face, every small figure that passed by, and each time my heart squeezed with pain and disappointment because it was always someone else. Eventually, I became afraid of the people around me, their sympathetic glances, the quiet conversations that ceased when I entered a room began to oppress me even more. I started to avoid meeting friends, stopped answering calls, stopped going to stores or any public places. Every contact with other people only reminded me of what had happened, as if I carried some invisible mark that everyone saw and wanted to hide from. My mother tried to pull me out of this state. She often came, brought food, tried to talk to me about mundane things, tried to create an illusion of normalcy. But I knew that she was suffering too, that her pain was my pain as well. I saw tears in her eyes that she tried to hide from me, and that made me even weaker. I understood that she wanted to help, but I couldn't let her get close to my pain. It was my fault, my burden, and I had to carry it alone. Many times I wondered if there was any point in continuing the search at all. Was there any chance that he was alive, that he would return to me? And at the same time, I was afraid of the answer. I was afraid of a truth that could be worse than not knowing, because as long as there was no answer, I had at least a tiny hope, something to hold on to, even if that hope seemed futile. Several months had passed, and I felt myself gradually sinking into a state of hopelessness. Time became something blurry and abstract for me. The days merged into one endless stream, in which there was no difference between yesterday and today. The police continued their search, but there were no results. All the leads that emerged quickly faded, leaving nothing but an even greater emptiness in my heart. I remember the day I received the call. It was an ordinary morning. I was standing in the kitchen, looking at a cup of tea that had grown cold before I even tasted it. The phone rang loudly and unexpectedly, and I even flinched a little at the sound. An unfamiliar number lit up on the screen, and my heart stopped in anticipation. I answered, barely hearing my own voice, which trembled with excitement and fear. It was a man's voice. The stranger introduced himself as a volunteer who helps the homeless, feeds them, brings them warm clothes. He spoke carefully, as if afraid to scare me or give me false hope, but I felt my heart begin to beat faster with every word. He said that he had seen a boy among the homeless several times, very similar to the photograph he had seen in the advertisements posted around the city. The boy was with several homeless men who seemed to be taking care of him. At first, he thought he was the son of one of them, but then something bothered him, and he decided to call. I almost dropped the phone when I heard this. I couldn't believe that what I had dreamed of every night, what I had prayed for, could be so close. We agreed to meet immediately, and I rushed to the meeting, barely holding back tears and trembling hands. The man was waiting for me near a small coffee shop. He was young, with tired but kind eyes. He immediately reassured me, saying that he couldn't guarantee that it was my son, but he looked very similar. I thanked him many times, though my words seemed insufficient to convey my gratitude. He said he would show me the place where these homeless people usually stayed. We drove in silence. I was afraid to speak, afraid to scare away that thin thread of hope that trembled within me. When we arrived at the place, it was an old industrial zone, abandoned warehouses and dilapidated buildings where those who had long been forgotten and cast out of life lived. I got out of the car, feeling my heart pound so hard that it was difficult for me to breathe. The man led me. We passed by some old mattresses, boxes, traces of a bonfire. I saw the gazes of people who watched us, at first with distrust, and then simply with indifference. And suddenly I saw him. He was sitting on a small mattress, pressed against the wall, in a jacket I didn't recognize, but with a face I would recognize among thousands of others. My heart stopped for a moment, and then began to beat again with incredible force. I almost ran to him, but the man stopped me, asking me not to scare the child, who might not understand what was happening. I approached slowly, looking at him and trying to smile through the tears that were already flowing down my cheeks. He looked up and at me with curiosity and wariness, as if unsure whether I would harm him. I knelt beside him, trying not to frighten him, and quietly said his name. He didn't answer immediately, only watched me carefully. I repeated his name once more, and then something in his gaze changed. He seemed to recognize my voice, and his eyes filled with tears. I reached out my hand to him, and he hesitantly touched my fingers, then threw himself around my neck, hugging me so tightly that I felt his small body tremble with tears and fear. I pressed him to me, feeling my heart bursting with joy and pain at the same time. I had found him. He was alive. He was here with me, and at that moment, I understood that nothing else mattered because I was holding my life in my hands, which had returned to me. That day, life regained its meaning for me. I held him close, feeling the warmth of his small body, and listening to him cry, listening to him whisper something in my ear that I couldn't quite make out. But it didn't matter. The important thing was that he was here with me, alive and whole, and I could touch him. I could tell him how much I loved him and how much I missed him. Next to me stood people whom one usually avoids, people who live somewhere on the fringes of life. They watched us silently, and in their eyes I saw something unusual, a mixture of relief and anxiety, as if they were afraid that someone would now blame them for what had happened. I looked at them with gratitude, trying to say without words how much they had done for me, though perhaps they didn't even realize it themselves. Later, I learned their stories. These were people who had lost everything, homes, families, jobs, who had nothing but one small corner where they lived together, helping each other survive. They found my son the same day. He went out and got lost. At first, he cried and was scared, but they calmed him, fed him, and promised they would find his mom. They wanted to go to the police, but were afraid of being accused of kidnapping themselves, so they kept him with them, trying to protect him from danger and cold. When the police arrived, I insisted that none of these people be punished. On the contrary, I was grateful to them. I explained to everyone that they were the ones who saved my son, that they took care of him as best they could, even though they had nothing but their warm hearts. The police argued for a long time, clarifying things, but ultimately agreed that there was nothing to accuse these people of. When we returned home, my son barely left my side for the first few days, as if he was afraid that I would disappear again, or that he would get lost again. I saw how his gaze had changed, how he had become more serious and grown up in those few months. He told me in short fragments how he lived with those people, how they shared their last piece of bread with him, how they read him fairy tales and comforted him when he cried at night. I couldn't listen to these stories without tears, but in those tears there was not only grief and fear, but also gratitude that my son had met people on his path who did not let him perish. I was sincerely grateful to these strangers, and I decided to do everything I could to repay them. even a little. I started helping volunteers, collecting clothes, food, medicine, everything that could at least slightly ease the lives of these people. I wanted them to know that I remembered them and would always remember them. Over time, our lives slowly began to return to normal. We went for walks again. He played on the playground again, and I carefully watched his every move, afraid to let him out of my sight for even a second. But I understood that I couldn't hold him by my side forever, that I needed to learn to trust the world again and live without fear. One evening, when my son was already sleeping, I took out all the letters I had written to him during the time he was away. I sat by his bed and began to read them softly, as if he could hear me even in his sleep. I told him about all my feelings, about all those days when it was unbearably difficult for me, when I didn't know how to live on. I told him about my guilt, about how hard it was to forgive myself for those 5 minutes that almost cost me my entire life. When I finished reading the last letter, my son opened his eyes and looked at me. He smiled calmly and said to me very quietly, almost in a whisper, "Mom, everything is fine now." At that moment, I understood that my son had forgiven me, that he had never blamed me for what happened. He was wiser and stronger than I could have imagined, and that small, simple phrase became the most important thing in the world to me. I held him close and promised that now everything would be different, that I would never again allow fear or pain to destroy our lives. I understood that the past could not be changed, but the future was something I could create for both of us. And now, every new day, every new moment was a gift for which I thanked life, which had returned to me what was most precious. Those 5 minutes no longer haunted me. They became a reminder that life is fragile, but as long as we are alive, we always have a chance to change everything, to find what seemed forever lost, and to learn to live, love, and trust again.